December 6, 1991, Austin, Texas. A city that was usually alive with music, laughter, and youthful energy was about to be shaken to its very core by a crime so horrifying, so cold-blooded that even 3 decades later, people still whisper its name with fear: the yogurt shop murders. 4 teenage girls, full of dreams and innocence, walked into a small frozen yogurt store one evening, never knowing that it would be the last night of their lives. What followed was an act of brutality so savage that even hardened investigators struggled to comprehend it. This case became one of the most haunting and controversial murder mysteries in American history. Tonight, we will take you deep inside the shadows of that chilling December night. We will revisit the laughter of young girls, the ordinary glow of a family-run yogurt shop, and the devastating silence that followed when fire consumed the building. This isn't just a story of murder. It's a story of shattered innocence, broken families, and a justice system that left more questions than answers. So, sit tight, keep your lights dimmed, and listen closely as we uncover the terrifying events of the yogurt shop murders. But remember, what you're about to hear is not fiction. It happened, and the horror still lingers in the hearts of those who remember. It was a Friday night in Austin, Texas, December 6, 1991. The city was alive with the buzz of holiday cheer. Christmas lights twinkled from houses, the crisp winter air carried the smell of pine trees, and people filled the streets, shopping for gifts and celebrating the season. In the midst of this joyful chaos sat a little yogurt shop called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. It wasn't a place that stood out, just a small store on Anderson Lane, tucked into a strip mall, a hangout spot for friends and families. Inside, 4 young girls worked and laughed together. Jennifer Harbison, just 17, was in charge that night. Her younger sister, Sarah, only 15, had come along to keep her company. With them was Eliza Thomas, 17, Jennifer's best friend. And finally, Amy Ayers, just 13 years old, the youngest of them all, too young even for a job, but allowed to stay because she was friends with the girls. These were just normal teenagers, chatting, joking, dreaming about school dances, crushes, and their future plans. None of them could imagine that their lives would be stolen within hours. As the night deepened, customers came and went. Families stopped by for late-night yogurt. Teenagers hung around laughing over shared sundaes. And through it all, the girls worked cheerfully, keeping the shop clean, counting money, and preparing to close. At first glance, it was nothing more than a quiet evening, the kind of shift these girls had worked dozens of times before. But behind that cozy scene, danger was already closing in. At around 10 p.m., the girls began their routine for closing. Chairs were stacked, the counters were wiped, and the cash register was checked. Jennifer, the responsible one, made sure every task was done properly. Sarah, playful and full of teenage energy, teased her sister for being too serious. Eliza helped organize the back, while Amy tried to make herself useful even though she wasn't technically an employee. There was laughter, the sound of soda cans cracking open, the faint hum of the freezer machines. It was normal, heartbreakingly normal. Unbeknownst to them, someone, or perhaps more than one person, was watching. Outside, in the parking lot, shadows moved. People saw strange men hanging around that strip mall earlier, but no one thought much of it. After all, it was Austin, a city where crime like this wasn't expected. The strip mall lights glowed, cars passed, but within that little shop, innocence was about to be ripped apart in the most brutal way possible. By 11 p.m., the last customers left. The girls locked the doors, and the world outside seemed quiet. But the stillness of the night was deceptive. Something sinister lurked just beyond those glass doors. The yogurt shop, with its pastel walls and sweet scents, was about to become a crime scene so gruesome, so unthinkable, that seasoned detectives would spend decades haunted by what they found. And as the girls smiled through their final conversations, they had no idea the nightmare that was about to descend. As midnight approached, the strip mall grew eerily quiet. The shops surrounding the yogurt store had already closed, their neon lights dimmed, and the parking lot became almost deserted. A cold December wind blew through the empty spaces, carrying with it a silence that felt unnerving to anyone who might have been paying attention. But for the girls inside, there was nothing unusual about it. It was late, yes, but not frightening. They were used to closing shifts, and the comforting presence of each other kept the night from feeling lonely. Jennifer, being the oldest and the one trusted by management, was counting the money in the register carefully. She was focused, trying to make sure everything balanced perfectly. Eliza, her closest friend, was helping to clean up the counters, moving quickly, wanting to finish and head home. Sarah, Jennifer's younger sister, was playing around with Amy, the youngest of the group, laughing at silly jokes and enjoying the carefree bond of sisterhood and friendship. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and little did they know, they were living the last precious minutes of their lives. Outside the store, headlights flashed as a car drove slowly past. Some witnesses later reported seeing strange men loitering near the parking lot earlier that night. A few people described them as suspicious, but no one could have predicted the evil that was brewing. No one called the police. No one intervened. That single decision, to ignore what seemed like harmless strangers, would later haunt an entire community. Inside, the girls locked the front door. But as investigators would later piece together, someone managed to get inside. Whether the girls let them in willingly, perhaps thinking they were friends or regular customers, or whether the intruders forced their way inside, remains a mystery to this day. What we do know is this: sometime after 11:30 p.m., the normalcy of the yogurt shop shattered. Imagine it for a moment: the bright fluorescent lights overhead, the pastel-colored walls decorated with cheerful yogurt posters, the hum of the refrigerators, the faint smell of sugar and toppings. 4 innocent girls trapped in a place that should have been safe. And then, footsteps, a voice, the sudden shift of atmosphere as danger made itself known. Their laughter must have died instantly, replaced by fear and confusion. What happened next would remain hidden for hours, only to be discovered in the most horrific way imaginable. But, in that frozen moment, before violence erupted, the girls were still alive, still breathing, still clinging to the fragile belief that nothing bad could happen in their small corner of Austin. It was the last fragile calm before the storm, the final heartbeat of innocence before the night descended into unimaginable horror. The clock was moving past 11:45 p.m. Inside the yogurt shop, everything should have been winding down. Jennifer was preparing to finish the cash count. Eliza was sweeping near the counter. Sarah was gathering the last cups and napkins, and Amy, still just a child, sat nearby waiting patiently for her friends to finish. But suddenly the peaceful routine shifted. The sound of the front door opening broke the silence. Witnesses later claimed that the girls might have unlocked the door for the last customers, perhaps thinking it was safe. But whoever walked in didn't come for yogurt. They came with darker intentions. The atmosphere must have changed instantly. Perhaps it started with uneasy smiles, the kind where your instincts whisper that something isn't right. Maybe the men asked strange questions, or maybe their tone was sharp, commanding. We will never know the exact words spoken, but what investigators pieced together suggested the girls were quickly overpowered. The intruders weren't there for money alone. They were predators, and the yogurt shop had just become their hunting ground. Jennifer, always protective of her little sister, would have stepped forward. She was the oldest, the leader, the one who naturally shielded Sarah and Amy. Eliza, her loyal best friend, stood with her. 4 against however many intruders entered, but the girls were young, fragile, and unprepared for what they faced. Fear began to take hold, creeping into their voices, their shaking hands, their quick glances at each other. This wasn't just a robbery anymore. This was something much worse. In those moments, the shop was no longer familiar. The colorful posters of ice cream cones, the cheerful music, the shiny counters, none of it mattered. The walls felt smaller, the air felt heavier, and the presence of evil filled every corner. The intruders took control, forcing the girls into submission. Imagine the pounding of their hearts, the quiet sobs, the whispers of comfort they must have shared with each other, trying desperately to stay calm. The door was locked, the world outside silent. No one could hear them. No one could help. At some point the lights may have been dimmed. Investigators later found evidence that suggested the girls were bound and gagged. 4 teenagers tied together like helpless prey in a place they once considered safe. The terror must have been suffocating. Did Jennifer promise Sarah that everything would be okay? Did Amy cry out for her mother? Did Eliza try to stay brave for her friends? These haunting questions will forever remain unanswered. The night had fully turned dark inside that yogurt shop. Outside, Austin slept peacefully under holiday lights, unaware that within those pastel-colored walls, a nightmare was unfolding, one that would scar the city forever. The intruders weren't finished. In fact, the worst was yet to come. And as the clock neared midnight, the horror reached a level no one could have imagined. Just after midnight, the stillness of Austin's Anderson Lane was shattered by a sight no one expected, a blaze erupting from the yogurt shop. Flames clawed through the windows, smoke billowed into the night sky, and the scent of burning plastic, wood, and chemicals filled the air. At first glance, it seemed like a simple accident, an electrical fire, perhaps. Neighbors saw the smoke rising and called the fire department, unaware that what lay inside was far more terrifying than flames. Within minutes, firefighters arrived. They rushed toward the blaze, their heavy boots pounding the pavement, hoses spraying water against the stubborn fire. But something about the scene felt strange. The flames weren't wild and chaotic like most accidental blazes. They were deliberate, concentrated, as though someone wanted the fire to destroy evidence. The firefighters pushed forward anyway, determined to put out the flames before the building collapsed. As the smoke cleared, the true nightmare revealed itself. In the back of the shop, amid the charred remains of yogurt machines and toppled chairs, lay the bodies of 4 girls. They were stacked together, burned, bound, and lifeless. The heat of the fire had scarred their features, but there was no mistaking who they were: Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy. Their final resting place was not in their beds at home, not surrounded by family, but in the ashes of a place they once considered safe. The firefighters who discovered them froze in shock. These were not adults caught in an accident. They were children, teenagers with lives ahead of them. Some of the firefighters turned away, unable to stomach the sight. One described later that it was the most haunting discovery of his career. The smell of smoke and death lingered in the air, clinging to their uniforms, searing itself into their memories forever. Investigators arrived quickly, and what they saw confirmed their worst fears. This was no accident. The fire had been set deliberately, using accelerants to cover up the crime. The girls hadn't died from smoke inhalation alone. They had been brutally murdered first. Bound, gagged, assaulted, and then left to burn in an attempt to erase the evidence. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare, one that no one in Austin could ever have imagined. By dawn, the news had spread across the city like wildfire. Parents clutched their children tighter, neighbors whispered in fear, and the once busy yogurt shop became a symbol of horror. A crime so savage, so merciless, had unfolded in the heart of their community, and the people demanded answers. But answers would not come easily. What lay ahead was decades of confusion, false confessions, trials, overturned convictions, and a chilling mystery that still remains unsolved. The morning after the fire, Austin woke to a chilling headline: 4 teenage girls found dead in yogurt shop fire. For many, it sounded too grotesque to be real. Parents drove past the blackened remains of the store with tears in their eyes, horrified that such evil had unfolded so close to home. Reporters swarmed the scene, cameras flashing, while police set up barricades to keep the public at bay. But no amount of yellow tape could contain the grief and fear spreading through the community. The city was in mourning, and beneath that sorrow lay a burning question: who could have done this? Inside the charred remains, detectives worked tirelessly, combing through ashes, melted wires, and broken glass. Every clue mattered: a burned matchbook, shoe prints, melted bindings, and traces of accelerant. The fire had destroyed much of the evidence, just as the killers intended, but some fragments remained. It was clear the girls had been bound and gagged. It was clear the fire was no accident. But the crime scene was so contaminated and chaotic that finding a definitive lead was like trying to assemble a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Meanwhile, fear gripped Austin. Parents refused to let their daughters out of their sight. Teenagers who once worked late-night shifts quit their jobs. Families demanded answers at town meetings. The yogurt shop, once a place of laughter, became a shrine. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes piled up outside its scorched entrance. The community clung together in sorrow, but also in paranoia. Whispers spread that a killer, or killers, was still walking free among them. The Austin Police Department scrambled. Detectives interviewed dozens of people: customers who had visited that night, neighbors who lived near the strip mall, even strangers who had been spotted loitering outside. Witnesses recalled seeing 2 men acting suspiciously near the store before the fire. Others remembered a pair of young men leaving in a car just before midnight. But every lead seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving detectives frustrated and desperate. With pressure mounting, the investigation began casting a wider net. Police rounded up local troublemakers, young men with criminal histories, and even drifters passing through town. Rumors spread like wildfire, some pointing fingers at gang members, others at random killers. But no solid evidence emerged. Instead, the case began to drown in confusion, speculation, and mounting public anger. The truth was, the yogurt shop murders were unlike anything Austin had ever faced. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't random bad luck. This was cold, calculated cruelty, 4 innocent lives stolen, and the killers had covered their tracks with fire. Detectives knew the answers were out there, buried beneath lies and half-truths. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, one terrifying reality became clear. Justice for the 4 girls would not come quickly. As months passed with no arrests, the pressure on the Austin Police Department grew unbearable. The families of the victims demanded justice. The media hounded investigators daily, and the community's patience was wearing thin. Detectives, desperate for answers, began chasing every lead, no matter how thin. This hunger to solve the case quickly would prove disastrous, leading the investigation down dark alleys of false promises and wrongful arrests. It started with rumors. Teenagers bragging in schoolyards, drifters exaggerating stories, and jailhouse whispers that hinted at confessions. Detectives followed up, pulling in suspects one after another. Some of these young men had criminal records, others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And when interrogation rooms heated up, the line between truth and manipulation blurred. Under pressure, some suspects cracked, not because they were guilty, but because they were terrified. Among them were 4 young men whose names would become infamous in connection with the case: Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. They were barely out of their teens, with rough edges and rebellious pasts. But none of them had ever been tied to something as brutal as the yogurt shop murders. Still, police zeroed in, convinced they had their killers. What followed was a series of interrogations that lasted for hours, sometimes days, until words slipped from their mouths that detectives seized upon as confessions. But the confessions didn't line up. Details changed. Timelines clashed. The stories were inconsistent, riddled with holes, and yet prosecutors pressed forward. The public wanted closure, and law enforcement wanted to deliver it. So the case was built on shaky statements, with little to no physical evidence to back them up. For years, these young men carried the weight of being labeled as murderers, even though their guilt was far from proven. Meanwhile, the real killers, whoever they were still free. That chilling fact loomed over Austin like a shadow. Families of the victims were torn between hope and doubt. On one hand, arrests had been made, giving the illusion of progress. On the other hand, nagging questions remained. Why didn't the evidence match? Why were the confessions so flawed? Why did something about the case still feel unresolved? The wrongful focus on these 4 suspects would eventually unravel in court, but not before years of their lives were consumed. And as the truth about false confessions slowly surfaced, so did an even more disturbing reality. The investigation into the yogurt shop murders was no closer to answers than it had been on that cold December night. Time was slipping away, memories fading, and the trail growing colder. By the late 1990s, nearly a decade after the murders, the case finally went to trial. The 4 young men, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn, were dragged into courtrooms as the alleged killers of the yogurt shop girls. For the families, it was a moment they had long awaited. They sat in the gallery, clutching photos of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, praying for justice. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension, the silence heavy with expectation. Would this be the moment when answers came, when the nightmare finally ended? Prosecutors painted a chilling picture. They leaned heavily on the confessions wrung from hours of interrogation. They told the jury that the 4 young men had entered the yogurt shop that night, robbed it, assaulted the girls, and then set it ablaze to hide their crimes. But the evidence was fragile. There were no fingerprints tying them to the scene, no DNA, no solid physical proof. The entire case hinged on words spoken under duress, words that often contradicted one another. Still, juries wanted closure. And in the late 1990s, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were convicted. Springsteen was sentenced to death. Scott received life in prison. The families wept, some feeling a measure of relief, others silently wrestling with doubt. For them, justice, even imperfect justice, felt better than the endless limbo of waiting. But that fragile relief would soon be ripped away. As appeals moved forward, cracks in the convictions became impossible to ignore. Defense attorneys revealed how coercive the interrogations had been, how much pressure had been placed on vulnerable young men, and how the so-called confessions didn't match key forensic evidence. Even more damning, DNA recovered from the crime scene didn't belong to any of the 4 accused. The prosecution's foundation crumbled, leaving behind only uncertainty and frustration. One by one, the convictions unraveled. Springsteen's death sentence was overturned. Scott's life sentence was thrown out. The charges against Pierce and Wellborn collapsed. By 2009, all 4 of the accused were free men. For the public, it was shocking. For the families of the victims, it was devastating. They had endured trials, listened to gruesome details, clung to fragile hope, and now they were back at square one. In the end, the trials brought no closure. Instead, they reopened old wounds. Parents were forced to relive the horror in court, only to walk away with empty hands once again. The killers were still out there, and decades after the fire, the case that had haunted Austin remained unsolved. The families had to face the unbearable truth. Justice for Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy was still painfully out of reach. By the mid-2000s, technology had leapt forward in ways investigators of 1991 could never have imagined. DNA testing, once primitive and limited, had become a powerful tool capable of unlocking secrets buried for decades. Austin detectives, desperate for a breakthrough, returned to the evidence from the yogurt shop. Samples that had once been too degraded or too small were retested. Families held their breath. Maybe, just maybe, science would succeed where human testimony had failed. And indeed, the DNA results brought new revelations. Strands of male DNA were discovered at the crime scene. But here was the twist. None of it matched Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn. The very men once convicted and paraded as killers had no forensic link to the crime. This discovery was both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, it confirmed what many already suspected, that the convictions were flawed. On the other, it raised a far darker question. If not them, then who? The unknown DNA became the case's haunting ghost, a silent reminder that the real culprits had slipped away. Detectives ran it through national databases, hoping for a match. But year after year, the results came back empty. Whoever left that DNA had either never been arrested or their profile had never been entered into the system. It was like chasing a shadow, always close, always visible, but impossible to grasp. For the families, the news was crushing. Once again, the system had failed them. They had endured the trauma of wrongful trials, only to learn that the real killers were still out there. Parents of the victims grew older, their grief never softening. They appeared at press conferences, pleading for answers, their voices breaking with age but never with determination. "We just want justice," they said. "We just want to know who did this to our girls." Meanwhile, the city of Austin lived under a quiet cloud of fear. People whispered that the killers had blended back into society. Maybe they were still in Texas. Maybe they were fathers now, living ordinary lives, hiding their monstrous past. Or maybe they had moved far away, confident they had gotten away with murder. The thought was chilling, that such evil could exist undetected, free to walk among the innocent. Every time the case made the news again, old wounds reopened. The faces of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy stared out from photographs, smiling, full of youth, forever frozen in 1991. Their laughter, their dreams, their futures had been stolen. And though DNA offered a sliver of hope, it also deepened the mystery. Because until a name matched that ghostly profile, the yogurt shop murders would remain an open wound, a question with no answer, a story unfinished. For the families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, time never brought healing. Decades passed, but the pain stayed as raw as it had been on that December night in 1991. Birthdays came and went. Holidays arrived with empty chairs at the dinner table. Parents aged under the weight of grief, their eyes forever haunted by the memory of their daughter's laughter and the horror of how that laughter had been silenced. For them, every passing year was not just another marker of loss, but another reminder that justice had not been served. Jennifer and Sarah's mother once described the heartbreak as living in two worlds. One world where she remembered her daughters as vibrant, Happy Girls Full of Promise, and another where she relived the phone call that shattered her life. Eliza's loved ones kept her memory alive with stories and photos, but behind every smile was sorrow. And Amy, just 13 years old, was remembered as the little girl who never got the chance to grow up, never got to go to prom, never got to graduate. Their futures were stolen, and their families were left to carry that unbearable truth. For the city of Austin, the yogurt shop murders became a scar on its identity. The cheerful store on Anderson Lane was reduced to rubble, but the memory of what happened inside never faded. People who were teenagers at the time of the murders now raised their own children with a different kind of caution. They told stories about locking doors, about not trusting strangers, about the evil that could lurk in the most ordinary places. The yogurt shop wasn't just a crime scene, it was a symbol of innocence lost. Community vigils were held year after year. Candles flickered in the cold December nights. Prayers were whispered, and the victims' names were spoken aloud so they would never be forgotten. Yet even in these moments of unity there was frustration. People asked the same painful question: how could such a horrific crime remain unsolved for so long? And what kind of world allows killers to walk free while families drown in grief? The unanswered questions were the cruelest part. Who were the men seen outside the shop that night? How did they gain the girls' trust, or did they force their way in? Why target a small yogurt shop of all places? And most importantly, where are they now? Every theory was debated, every rumor dissected, but without hard evidence, the case remained a mystery. The unknown DNA was like a whisper in the dark, a constant reminder that the truth existed but remained hidden. For those closest to the case, the yogurt shop murders were not just about the brutality of the crime. It was about the endless ache of the unknown. To lose someone you love is unbearable. To lose them in such a violent way is worse. But to lose them and never know who took them away is a torment beyond words. And that torment continues to echo through Austin, through the families, and through every person who still remembers the night the yogurt shop burned. Decades have passed since that December night in 1991, yet the yogurt shop murders remain one of America's most chilling unsolved cases. Detectives have retired, new ones have stepped in, and technology has advanced beyond what anyone back then could imagine. And still, the case sits open, its files heavy with photographs, interviews, and unsolved mysteries. Every year, cold case investigators revisit the evidence, hoping that one new lead, one fresh perspective, will finally bring the killers into the light. The mystery is both simple and impossibly complex. 4 teenage girls were murdered, a fire set to cover the evidence, and DNA from unknown men remains unclaimed in national databases. The story should be solvable. Science says the answers are there. But without a name to match the DNA, without a credible witness, without one piece of undeniable evidence, the killers remain hidden. And as time passes, the chance of someone breaking their silence grows smaller. Still, cases like this have been solved decades later. Sometimes all it takes is one slip, one confession overheard, one distant relative uploading DNA to a genealogy website. For the families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, that hope keeps them going. They pray for the day they can stand in a courtroom and look into the eyes of the men who destroyed their daughters' lives. They pray for a day when the word justice will finally mean something. But until then, the yogurt shop murders remain an open wound on Austin's history. The burned store is long gone, replaced by other businesses, but the ghosts remain. People still drive past that stretch of Anderson Lane with a heavy heart, remembering the girls who never came home. For longtime residents, the smell of smoke, the sight of fire trucks, and the sound of sirens from that night are memories they can never erase. The killers themselves, where are they now? That question keeps people awake at night. Are they living ordinary lives, blending into society as though nothing happened? Are they sitting in living rooms, watching their own children laugh, all while knowing what they did in 1991? Or are they gone, carrying their secrets to the grave? The uncertainty is suffocating, because somewhere out there, someone knows the truth. Someone remembers what happened in that yogurt shop. Someone has carried this darkness in silence for decades, and so the story of the yogurt shop murders doesn't end here. It lingers in the air, in the hearts of families, in the silence of unanswered questions. The fire that was meant to erase the evidence has instead fueled a legacy of sorrow, suspicion, and endless searching. The case remains open, the mystery unsolved, and justice denied. For Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, the world still waits for the truth. This is not just a story, It is a wound that never healed. 4 young girls with bright futures were silenced in the most brutal way imaginable, and their families are still waiting for answers. The yogurt shop murders remind us of how fragile life is and how evil can hide in plain sight. Somewhere out there, the people responsible are still walking free. And that should chill every single one of us. If you believe their story deserves justice, don't let their names fade away. Share this video, keep their memory alive, and maybe one day, the truth will come to light. Your voice matters. Every view, every share, every comment keeps pressure on those who can still solve this case. Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy deserve more than to be remembered as victims. They deserve to be remembered as daughters, sisters, friends, girls whose lives mattered. Let's make sure the world never forgets them. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, hold your loved ones close, and never take tomorrow for granted. Until next time.